Welcome to the Thinking Stack. So here's the thought, and it might ruffle some feathers or maybe just make you laugh. Is this whole thing we call love, the poetry, the big gestures, maybe even some questionable life choices, is it all just biology's way of getting us to, well, reproduce? I mean, think about it. We pour something like, what, $72 billion a year into the U.S. wedding industry alone? Is that just marketing for hormones?
Or maybe, just maybe, it's a bit more sophisticated than just a trick. Think of it like a really old, finely tuned biological program, not some, cosmic destiny thing, but more like a cascade of, dopamine hits. And then there's that stickiness of attachment chemicals, kind of a biological handshake maybe after the neat event.
So when someone says, you complete me, they might actually be saying, my brain chemistry is doing interesting things when you're around, which evolutionarily is probably good for potential kids.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
That's a blunt way to put it, but basically. So let's try and unpack this using our framework, the integrated thinking stack. We'll look through three main domains, sort of like different sets of glasses. First is perception. How do we actually see what's true versus what we wish was true?
Okay.
And what are the ethics involved?
Right, seeing clearly.
Then prediction. Thinking longer term, what's the biology doing? How does it ripple out into society? What's the messy reality of how people actually behave?
Got it.
And finally, action. How do we deal with all this? How do we build resilience, navigate this uncertainty with our eyes open?
All right, the ITS. It sounds like Darwin meets, practical life advice. So our mission here is pretty clear. Cut through the fluff, right? No fairy tales allowed.
Exactly. We're aiming for a stark look at the evolutionary mechanics behind love.
Okay. Let's start with domain 1, perception. And layer 1 is cognitive cleanse. That's intense.
It is, in a way. The question is simple but tough. What's actually undeniably true here? Stripped of all the romance, the assumptions, the cultural baggage, what does the raw data say?
Cold, hard data on love. Okay.
Well, the fundamental truth, coming straight from neuroscience, is that romantic love, it's basically biological machinery. It's not some mystical soul connection. Brain scans, MRI studies specifically, they show that when you're feeling that intense romantic love, your brain activity looks remarkably similar to someone on, cocaine.
Seriously, cocaine.
Yeah. The same reward pathways light up. Areas like the ventral tegmental area, the VTA, and the caudate nucleus, these are deep in the brain's reward system.
So that feeling, that dizzy, can't eat, can't sleep feeling of falling in love, it's literally like a drug hit in the brain.
That's what the scan suggests, yes.
Yeah.
It helps explain some of the, let's say, less rational behavior associated with it. And it's driven by this neurochemical cocktail. You've got dopamine, that's the big one for craving, motivation, wanting more. Then oxytocin, which helps build trust and that feeling of bonding. And vasopressin, important for more long-term attachment.
Wow. So it's a potent mix.
Absolutely. Researchers like Helen Fisher and Samir Zucki have done groundbreaking work on this. They've shown, pretty convincingly, that it's biology, a kind of sophisticated addiction almost, not magic.
An addiction loop. How does that work?
Well, think about it. You get the reward, maybe sex, maybe just close bonding that triggers the craving for the person. This leads to rituals, dates, shared habits, which reinforce the bond and provide relief from that craving.
And then you want the reward again.
Exactly. Round and round it goes, a loop designed by evolution, essentially.
Okay, but why? Why did evolution bother building this elaborate, addictive chemical loop? What's the point?
The point seems to be our kids. Human babies are what biologists call altricial. They're born incredibly helpless, needing a ton of care for a long time.
Right, unlike, say, a baby horse that can walk almost immediately.
Precisely. So having two parents sticking around to invest time and resources, that significantly boosts the offspring's chances of survival. Love, in this evolutionary view, is the mechanism that encourages that pair bonding, that cooperation.
So it's like a biological insurance policy for the next generation. Nature's way of getting parents to stick together, at least for a while.
That's a good way to think about it. Helen Fisher talks about it as a brain system that evolved to help us focus our mating energy on one person at a time. Conserves resources, increases the odds of raising young successfully. It's about evolutionary efficiency, really.
But hang on, it's not always just about finding one perfect mate for life, is it? I've heard about this dual mating hypothesis.
Yes. That adds another layer of complexity. From an evolutionary standpoint, particularly for women, the strategy might not always be simple monogamy.
How so?
Well, the dual mating hypothesis, which researchers like Gangestad and Thornhill have explored, suggests women might unconsciously look for different things in different types of partners.
Okay.
For a short-term fling, maybe the focus is on signs of good genes, indicators of health, attractiveness, maybe even dominance, things that could produce robust offspring.
Right, the alpha type, maybe?
Potentially. But for a long-term partner, the one you'd raise children with, the priority might shift towards traits like reliability, willingness to invest resources, kindness, the good dad traits.
The beta provider, as they sometimes call it.
Exactly. So love and mating strategies from this perspective aren't necessarily a single track towards lifelong monogamy. It can be more nuanced, more flexible depending on the context.
So summing up layer one, underneath all the songs and poems, love is fundamentally biological hardware, not destiny.
That's the core takeaway from the cognitive cleanse, yes. Powerful biological machinery.
Okay, wow, that's a lot to take in. So if that's the biological reality, where does that leave us ethically? That brings us to layer two, moral intelligence, right?
Precisely. The guiding question now becomes, given this biological basis, what's the right way to approach love and relationships, ethically speaking? Does knowing the mechanics just drain all the meaning out of it?
Yeah, does it make it all feel a bit pointless?
Not necessarily. I think this is where critical thinking really matters. Understanding the function doesn't automatically erase the meaning, you know?
Okay.
Just because we know why evolution might have favored these feelings doesn't mean the feelings themselves aren't incredibly profound and important to us as individuals. But a mature sense of morality about love requires us to be honest about these underlying drivers. We can't just pretend they don't exist.
Right, because if we stick to the purely romantic, idealized version, that can actually hide some pretty ugly stuff, can it?
Absolutely. Think about power dynamics in relationships. Dependency. Sometimes subtle, sometimes not so subtle exploitation or manipulation, especially when you factor in traditional gender roles.
Yeah, you mentioned thinkers like Carol Gilligan and bell hooks. They've written a lot about this, haven't they? How the romantic ideal can mask inequality.
They have. And Eva Illouz talks about how the whole "you complete me" narrative, while sounding nice, can reinforce these social scripts where often one person historically, usually the woman, is expected to sacrifice more, do more emotional labor to make the relationship work.
So the fairy tale can actually prop up unfair systems.
It can. When love is built on a foundation of inequality or demands one person shrink themselves for the other's comfort, that's ethically questionable, wouldn't you say?
Definitely. It's a stark contrast to how love is sometimes presented in philosophy or spirituality, isn't it? Like Plato or Rumi talking about love as this divine transcendent thing.
Exactly. You have that view, love as sacred, connecting us to something higher. And then you have the biological view, love as strategic, rooted in survival. That tension. It demands some ethical humility, I think.
Humility, meaning?
Meaning we have to acknowledge the complexity. Love's moral weight isn't fixed or eternal. It becomes contextual. It's still hugely important, deeply human, incredibly messy, but maybe not because it's divinely ordained.
So a mature ethics of love means being compassionate about our biological wiring, but also holding ourselves accountable.
Yes, I think so. Holding both truths. Love, I'd say, biochemical process. And it can be a source of incredible psychological safety, growth, and meaning. But that meaning is shaped by our choices, our culture, our memories, not just the chemicals.
Okay. Domain one feels clear, if a bit bracing. We've seen the engine, considered the ethics. What about domain two? Prediction. Looking at the bigger picture, the future.
Right. Layer 3 is systemic foresight. Now we zoom out. What are the long-term ripples of this biologically rooted thing called love across society? What are the large-scale impacts?
The love industrial complex, you called it earlier.
Exactly. We've built this enormous industry around it. Dating apps, the massive wedding business, Hollywood turning out rom-coms. It's all capitalizing on love, turning it into this consumable myth.
But big business, that's $72 billion on weddings is just staggering.
It is. And dating apps are multi-billion-dollar markets. Valentine's Day, another huge spend. Eva Illouz really nailed how love has become financialized.
And it's everywhere, right? Not just the US or Europe, Bollywood, K-pop, Disney. It's a global export.
A global love factory, you could say. But you have to ask, is this factory producing genuine happiness? Or is it more about, well, efficiently transmitting genes and keeping social structures humming along?
It's interesting because historically marriage wasn't always about love, was it? It was more about stability, alliances, property.
Precisely. Arranged marriages, alliances between families, these served clear systemic functions. Social cohesion was key. But today's love market, especially with things like dating apps, it introduces a different kind of dynamic, maybe even instability.
How so? Like the paradox of choice. Too many options.
That's part of it. Choice overload, definitely. Maybe commitment phobia. And those little dopamine hits you get from matching or swiping, they can create addictive loops, potentially leading to, well, psychological bumps in the road. Researchers like Eli Finkel have looked into this.
And the apps themselves, they're designed to optimize, right? Swipe left, swipe right.
Exactly. It's an optimization logic. Discard or potential upgrade. The design itself pushes us towards judging based on surface stuff, maybe at the expense of building deeper connection or resilience.
Which might even contribute to relationships breaking down more easily.
Some researchers, like Jean Twenge, suggest these trends are linked. So when you're swiping, are you really choosing freely? Or are you kind of playing a game designed by an algorithm?
A game with pretty high stakes.
Yeah. For a lot of people, especially younger folks, it can start to feel less like finding love and more like, well, like a bit of a scam maybe, a rigged game.
Okay, let's zoom back into the individual level. Layer 4, embodied insight. This is about our wiring, right? What are we biologically programmed for, and how does that mess with our heads and relationships?
It's really digging into that raw programming. And the key thing to grasp is that evolution didn't design us for lifelong, blissful romance in the way the fairy tales tell it.
Not for happily ever after.
Not primarily, no. Evolution's bottom line is reproductive efficiency.
Yeah.
Passing on genes.
So the neurochemistry, the oxytocin, the dopamine, it serves that purpose.
Fundamentally, yes. Oxytocin and vasopressin create trust, bonding, but think of it as a kind of post-coital reward system. Nature's way of encouraging parents to stick together to raise the kids.
So that soulmate feeling, it's just a really good chemical high.
In neurobiological terms, yes. Zeki and Fisher's work points strongly in that direction. And remember, our nervous systems evolved under conditions of scarcity and danger.
Survival mode.
Exactly. We're wired for survival, which often translates into things like craving, clinging, intense fear of loss when it comes to relationships. Threat detection is deeply embedded.
Is that why breakups hurt so damn much it feels like physical pain sometimes?
There's a reason for that. Studies show that the emotional pain of rejection or a breakup activates the same part of the brain, the anterior cingulate cortex, that processes physical pain.
Wow. So your brain literally treats heartbreak like a physical injury.
Or at least a significant threat. Emotional loss can register as an existential threat to our nervous system. Eisenberger's research really highlights this connection.
Okay. And it's not just about breakups, right? You mentioned attachment theory earlier, how our childhood affects our adult relationship.
Yes, absolutely crucial. Attachment theory, going back to John Bowlby and developed further by people like Levine and Heller, shows how our early bonds with caregivers create patterns.
Like secure, anxious, avoidant.
Exactly. Those patterns tend to play out in our adult romantic relationships. We often unconsciously reenact those early dynamics, those unresolved psychological scripts.
So our nervous system isn't really loving in the poetic sense. It's clinging, avoiding, trying to feel safe based on old programming.
That's a stark way to put it, but there's a lot of truth there. It's operating on survival logic. Seek safety, avoid threat, repeat familiar patterns.
And you also mentioned a darker side to oxytocin, the love hormone.
Yes, it's not all cuddles. While oxytocin promotes bonding within our in-group, our partner, our family, our team research suggests it can also increase suspicion or even aggression towards outgroups.
So it helps us bond with us, but can make us wary of them.
That's the potential downside, explored by researchers like Karsten Dedreau. It can foster in-group loyalty, but also tribalism, which means the biology of love isn't purely unifying. It can actually be, well, inherently political in how it plays out between groups.
Fascinating. And a bit disturbing. Okay, so that brings us to the reality check. Layer 5, human-centered design. We've got the biology, the systems. But how do people actually navigate all this in the real world? How do they behave, feel, push back, adapt?
Right. This is where we look at the messy human element. And the first thing you notice is people are often pretty irrational about love.
We cling to the idea of fate, destiny.
Massively. Despite all the evidence about biology and circumstance, the soulmate narrative is incredibly powerful. If you look at how people actually partner up, often it's about more practical things, like who's available, who lives nearby, who fits a familiar pattern from our past. Sociologists like Good and Fox pointed out that for much of history, marriage was about practicality economics, family ties, not romantic sparks.
So the Western idea of marrying purely for soulmate love is kind of unusual, historically and globally.
It's definitely a specific cultural export, not some universal human default. And we also see people constantly challenging the love equals reproduction idea.
How so?
Well, think about LGBTQ plus relationships, love between people who are asexual or infertile. The deep companionate love that people find later in life, long after childbearing years. These all show love serves purposes far beyond just making babies.
Yeah, you mentioned that study, something like 44% of younger adults not wanting kids, but still wanting partnership.
Exactly. Pew Research found that. It clearly shows that for many people today, love and long-term partnership are decoupled from the biological imperative to reproduce.
And yet, despite all this evidence, relationships ending, high divorce rates, love not always being about babies, we still chase the fantasy, don't we?
We do. Look at the divorce stats, around 39% for first marriages in the U.S. But the cultural narrative persists. Why? Because culture scripts it for us.
Narratives shape our expectations, and maybe even our brain chemistry.
It seems likely. Fall in love, find your purpose.
Yeah.
Break up, existential crisis. These aren't just feelings. They're stories we tell ourselves, reinforced constantly by media, by society.
So evolution provided the basic wiring,
Attraction, bonding, sure.
but culture built this whole elaborate identity structure on top of it.
Beautifully put. We try to design our lives logically, but love often runs on story, memory, emotion, friction. It's not neat.
And we want the fairy tale ending, but maybe aren't always willing to do the hard work of building the actual relationship.
That can be a trap, yes. The desire for the outcome without the process. And it's ironic, isn't it? You have these hyper-connected generations like Gen Z constantly online swiping. Yet studies like the Signal Loneliness Index show they report feeling more lonely.
More connection, less actual connection.
Potentially. The digital tools don't automatically translate into deep, meaningful bonds.
Okay, this feels like a natural transition to domain 3. Action. We see the biology, the systems, the human messiness. What happens when things go wrong, and what can we actually do about it?
Right. Layer 6 is risk and resilience. What are the downsides, the dangers, if we operate with flawed ideas about love? And how do we build relationships that can actually withstand the challenges?
So, if you believe love is just a biological trick, what's the risk there when the high wears off?
Well, one risk is disillusionment, turning into something darker, like post-love depression maybe, or even the kind of nihilism if it's all just chemicals. Does any of it really matter?
The deterministic trap, you called it, feeling like we have no real choice.
Exactly. That can lead people to detach emotionally, avoid real intimacy. Why bother if it's all predetermined and likely to fade anyway? Researchers like Robin Norwood wrote about these patterns.
The over-romanticized view has risks too, right? Believing too much in the fairy tale.
Huge risks. Emotional fragility is a big one. If your entire identity is wrapped up in finding the one and achieving this perfect idealized love, what happens when reality hits? When there's conflict or boredom or the relationship ends?
Identity collapse.
It can feel like that, leading to depression, obsession, maybe even destructive behaviors if people can't cope with the loss of the fantasy. And think about our tech-based dating systems. They have their own fragility.
How so? Platform dependency.
Yeah, we become reliant on these apps and their algorithms.
Yeah.
What happens if the platform changes or trust erodes or there's a major disruption like a pandemic? Algorithmic love, while efficient maybe, might be quite fragile when faced with real-world chaos.
So resilience means what? Not giving up on love, but seeing it more clearly.
Exactly. Loving while knowing the messiness, the biology, the cultural pressures, it means stopping the mythologizing.
Because the more sacred the myth,
The more fragile the reality,
With
the
you.
harder the fall when it doesn't live up to the impossible ideal. Resilience is about loving consciously,
consciously.
not just being swept away by the initial chemical storm. Seeing the patterns, understanding the triggers, but still making an active choice to care, to connect, to commit. In a way, it's an act of rebellion against pure biological determinism.
Choosing love, even knowing what's under the hood. Okay, so how do we actually do that? Layer 7, execution engine. What are the practical steps? How do we adapt?
The goal isn't to, nuke love from orbit. That's impossible and undesirable. The goal is to deprogram the fantasy.
Love literacy, teaching people what love isn't.
Precisely. We need to educate people starting young about the realities, about neurochemistry, yes, but also about attachment styles, consent, emotional intelligence, conflict resolution.
Shift the focus from just finding the right person to building the right skills.
Exactly. Education needs a serious rewire, and we need to design for long-term attachment, not just initial sparks.
Resilience design, you called it? What does that look like?
It means focusing on things beyond just, do we have chemistry?
Mm.
It means looking at shared values,
Yeah.
building shared rituals, assessing how well you handle stress together, how you navigate conflict.
Thinking of a partner as a co-founder of a nervous system journey.
I like that. It captures the active, collaborative elements, like designing a house and you need with a solid foundation. The plumbing, the wiring that works under pressure, not just a nice paint color.
So less focus on the initial fall, more on the long-term construction.
Yes. Build relationships that respect the biology but aren't ruled by it. Create meaning together. Stress test the connection through honesty and support. And please, let's stop confusing that initial chemical buzz with deep, lasting compatibility.
Therapeutic approaches fit in here too, right? Couples therapy.
Absolutely. Things like trauma-informed therapy, understanding somatic responses. These can help unravel those deep-seated patterns. Maybe even redesigning dating apps. Could they filter for emotional maturity instead of just photos?
A radical thought. So ultimately, it's about shifting from falling in love to engineering it.
Engineering might sound cold, but it implies conscious design, intention, skill. Love is awareness. Love is a craft.
A practiced art, not just a storm in the brain.
Let biology inform you, but let consciousness guide you.
So wrapping this all up, where does this deep dive leave us on the big question? Is love just an evolutionary tool?
Well, yes and no. And maybe. Its origins are clearly biological, no doubt about that.
But in our experience,
It becomes much more. A complex web of meaning, memory, psychological safety, or sometimes dysfunction,
and in its modern expression.
that often gets commodified, turned into an ideal, sold back to us, sometimes disconnected from deeper realities. It gets tangled up in stories and commerce.
So it's not one simple thing. It's complex, adaptive, sometimes misused.
Misnamed even. And we're wired with contradictions, aren't we? We crave the stability of the pair bond, but also the excitement of novelty.
A lot of our behavior around it seems irrational, but feels incredibly meaningful.
Deeply meaningful. And maybe the real risk isn't loving itself. Maybe the risk is loving without understanding why, without awareness of the forces shaping our choices.
So the revolution is loving with eyes wide open, knowing the biology, knowing the cultural scripts, and still choosing to care.
That's the challenge and the opportunity. To choose commitment, to build something real consciously.
So love isn't fake, it's just way more complicated than the stories tell us.
Exactly. And the more you understand those complications, maybe the freer you become to navigate them.
Stop chasing the myths.
Start building the relationship.
And maybe, just maybe, stop calling it falling in love.
And start calling it choosing. Choosing. Every single damn day.
This has been The Thinking Stack.
We're not here just to confirm the fairy tales.
We're here to help upgrade your operating system for reality.
Catch you next time.